Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel, Nerdy the Coder. Today we're going to be talking about object methods and this keyword. So in the previous lectures we talked about objects, and then we talked about how we can reference different objects and how they're saved in the memory or stored in the memory. And then we talked about garbage collection and objects. In today's lecture we're going to be talking about object methods and this keyword. Before we dive into the lecture, please make sure you watch the previous lectures on JavaScript in order to follow along. Let's just dive into the lecture. Objects are usually created to represent entities of the real world, like users, orders, and so on. And in the real world, a user can act, for example, selecting something from the shopping cart, and logging in and logging out, etc. Until now, we have been dealing with primitives as property value, but we can also assign functions to an object property. For example, we have an object and we assign it a property called hello, and we can assign a function to it directly. A function that is a property of an object is called its method. So for example, we have an object and it has a property and we assign it a function. Then that function is called method of that object. Let's have a look into example and see how it really looks. I will get rid of the old code, and for example, let's say we have a variable called user, and it's basically an object, and we have basic properties. For example, the name is John, and then we have, for example, let's say age, and let's say it's 30. Let's add a property to the user object. Let's say user.hi, but this hi will not contain a primitive value, but instead it will contain a function. And let's say it just console logs a message that says hello world. And now if we want to call this function, so this property is now being treated as a function. So now if I want to call this function, I can simply do user.hi, and I just have to follow it by parentheses, and it will call the function. When I load the page, refresh, you can see hello world is coming from the object itself. So here we have just used a function expression to create a function and assign it to a property that says user.hi of the object, and then we can call it as a user.hi with parentheses, and then the user speaks. Of course, we can also use a predeclare function as a method. What do I mean by this is, let's say that we have a function that is defined over here. Let's say this is the function and it has its own name that's called hi. I can just simply assign this to this property basically, and I can name this property anything that I want. For example, I want to name it hello, and then I call this hello function. So now I'm passing the reference of this function to this hello user property, and then I can call it like this. When I save it, refresh, you can still see the same message. Object-oriented programming. So when we write our code using objects to represent entities, that's called object-oriented programming. In short, we call it OOP. Object-oriented programming is a big thing and interesting science of its own. How to choose the right entities and how to organize the interaction between them, that's a full architecture. And there are a lot of great books on that topic, and we'll talk about this in details in the upcoming lectures. Method shorthand. There exists a short syntax for methods in an object literal. Let's see it in a practical example. So let's say we have this user function and we call it hello. And instead of doing it like this, so let's just not assign it a separate function, let's just make it part of the property itself. So what we can do here, we can simply make it like this. For example, we have a hello function over here. So instead of doing it like this, before we used to do this, and then console log a message. So, and this will work again, that's the same thing that we just did before, but we initialize the object with the function itself directly. But instead of doing it like this, we can use a shorthand property and we can get rid of the function itself and also the colon over here. So it will be just a full object and we can just call it directly. You can see that we are getting the same message. So as demonstrated over here, we can omit the function and just write hi or hello. To tell the truth, the notations are not fully identical. There are subtle differences related to object inheritance to be covered later, but for now they do not matter. In almost all cases, the short syntax is preferred. So it's always preferred to use the shortest syntax instead of going with the function name and the colon. This keyword and methods. It is common that an object method needs to access the information stored in the object to do its job. To access the object, a method can use the this keyword, and the value of this is basically the object itself. So let's say, for instance, we have this function over here, and I want to access a property of this user object. How can I do that? So to do that, basically, I can simply do console log this. So this basically refers to this object wherever this function is calling. This method is being declared, and then I can do this dot. You can see I have access to all of the methods and properties, and I can print out the name. When I save it and I call this function again, I'll get the full name over here. So here, during the execution of user.hello, the value of this will be user, basically the user object itself. So technically, it is also possible to access the object without this by referencing it while the outer variable. So we can also do something like user.name. User is basically this object, and then name is the property of this object. If I get rid of this and make it like this, then you can see I still have access to these properties. And when I save it and refresh, you can see I'm getting the same value. But such code is unreliable. If we decide to copy user to another variable, for example, admin, or any other variable or any other object, and overwrite user with something else, then it will access the wrong object. To demonstrate this example, let's say we have another variable that's called admin, and I assign user to this one, and then I do user equal null to make the user object unreachable. When I save it and refresh, you won't see anything but an error. You can see cannot read property of null because I set the user object to null. So even the user object exists, but since I modify it from here, then it's not really reliable to use or rely on the user, the object name itself. This is not bound. The this keyword basically is not bound. In JavaScript, the keyword this behaves unlike most other programming languages. It can be used in any function, even if it is not a method of an object. So what do I mean by that? Let's get rid of this code for now. Let's say we have a function over here, and its name is, for example, hi. And I do something like console log this name, and I call this function. You can see we are not getting any error or any value or anything like that. The value of this is evaluated during the runtime depending on the context. For instance, I'll get rid of this code and let's do a quick example. Let's say we have a user variable and we have a name property over here. We call it John. And then we have an admin variable and we have a property on this object that's called admin. Now we have a function over here, the same function that we just saw, and it says hi, okay, and then say console log, and then I say hello, and then say this name, and I simply do user dot hi equals hi, okay, or maybe I can simply say, just to make it different, and I can do the same thing for admin. When I call these functions, let's say I do user dot hello, and then I say admin dot hello, because we added these properties, so the hello function should now be available on either of these objects. When I save it, refresh, you can see hello John, hello admin. So now you have seen that it basically depends on where this method is, or which context that this method resides in. So in this case, in the user.hello is basically part of the user, and then in the admin case, it's basically the context of admin object. So that's why both of this have access to both of the admins. So this .name will first refer to the user object, and this .name will refer to admin. And the second call, what happens if we call the function hi without the object? Let's say what it returns. I'll just simply call this function and see what it returns. In some cases, this will be undefined. For example, in strict mode, if you try to access this .name or something, there will be an error. In non-strict mode, the value of this is, in such a case, will be the global object, but that's basically the window object in the browser. We'll get to it later in chapter global objects as well. But this is a historical behavior that ustrict fixes. Usually such call is programming error. If there is this inside a function, and expect this to be called in an object context. There are certain consequences of unbound this. If you come from another programming language, for example, then you are probably used to the idea of a bound this, where methods define and an object always have this reference in that specific object. In JavaScript, this is free. This keyword is free. Its value is evaluated at the call time, and it does not depend on where the method was declared, but rather on what object is before the dot. So basically, wherever you're calling it before the dot, for example, so it will reside in the context of user in this case, and in the second, it will reside, or it will be in the context of admin. So the concept of runtime evaluated this has both pluses and minuses. On the one hand, a function can be reused for different objects. On the other hand, the greater flexibility creates more possibilities for mistakes. Here is our position, is not to judge whether this language design decision is good or bad. We'll understand how to work with it, how to get benefits of and avoid problems. Arrow functions have note this. Arrow functions are special functions. They don't have their own this keyword. If you reference this from such a function, it's taken from the outer normal function. Let's take a look into an example. I'll get rid of this code for now, and let's say we have a function over here, and we call it hello, and let's say it's a arrow function, and then it will do the same thing, and it will, for example, say hello this dot name, let's say, and then over here I'll just call this function or method. When I save this file, refresh, you'll see hello but nothing. So this is basically the problem with the arrow function. It does not have its own this, and it cannot refer to the object. So to solve this problem, we have to create a wrapper around this arrow function. Let's say we call it hi, and or we can call it the same, let's say hello, and it will just, and in here we'll just declare our arrow function. It's called this, and we need console log, and we do the same thing over here, and we say this dot name. I'll get rid of this for now, and when I call this, make sure that we call the arrow function over here when I save it, refresh, you can see hello.john. So that is a special feature, you can say, of arrow functions. It is useful when we actually do not want to have a separate this, but rather take it from the outer context. So later in another chapter that we'll be covering in our upcoming lectures, we will revisit the arrow functions. We'll go more deeply into the arrow functions and we'll see how to deal with it. So that's it, basically the end of the lecture. I hope you have learned something new from this lecture. Please like and share the video, subscribe to the channel, make sure to press the bell icon for future updates. And until then, I'll see you in the next lecture.